Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for my 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. Since the last video update, the tank's front tin work have been fabricated, completed, and mounted to the model. The tank's side skirt mounts have also been fabricated and fitted, and I've been going through the process on sculpting the weld beads to the various armor plate locations. In this video, we're going to be going over all this info in more depth, so just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Starting this video off takes us to a brand new component that has been added to the ECA 1/6 scale Sherman catalog page, and this is again one of those items that I've been wanting to do for some time, and it's also one of those items that everyone, and I mean yes, everyone out there misses. So in true ECA fashion, we're filling in the blank spots. What we have here is the new ECA 3D printed M4 Sherman family side skirt mounts set. Anyone who's a fan of the Sherman and who has modeled the Sherman will tell you that the side of the hull, on the lower portion of the leading edge, there are these provisions for mounting on the tin work. And these provisions are found in just about all the Sherman variants, with the exception of some of the few early examples. But that's a topic for another video for another day. The tin work mounts are comprised of several steel strips that are perforated, and then these are welded to the side of the hull. However, one thing that everyone forgets to mention and also render out on their models more specifically are the inner portions, and this is where things get quite interesting, because if you look at the piece from the outside, you'll just see a strip with holes in it, and then you're wondering, well, how does the tin work actually fasten and secure to the pieces? Well, the secret is actually on the inside, and again, this is where everybody, including myself, have omitted these very important details. Well, at least up until now. Well, the secret is quite simple. In order to secure the tin work in place, the inner portion of the strip have these stamped sheet metal bosses that are welded to the strip. And these are found on every single vehicle on the leading edge on the inside. If these weren't there, the only way to fasten the things into place is to have someone go in there with a nut while another person tries to screw on the bolt on the outside. Is it doable? Yeah, probably. Is it very easily done? Probably not. So the designers, when they were coming up with these vehicles, they came up with this very clever solution over here. And what they did was they just stamped a bunch of these sheet metal little boxes, and these things are literally just welded to the inner portion of the strip. And this gives you the inner threading that the bolt will actually screw into, thus securing the piece in place. The pieces here are 3D printed, and they are literally just a single print. On the ECA part, I made as realistic as possible, where the inner portion here is hollow, and the outer portion gives you the geometry of the unit that was stamped on the original vehicles. The only thing you have to do is carefully just glue these to the appropriate locations, and you'll have your appropriate detailing for the undersection of the vehicle. The set contains a bunch of these components, and these here are more than enough to equip one vehicle. What is not included with the set are the actual strip material itself, and this is where the builder has quite some flexibility. You could either roll with a strip of styrene, you could cut your own strips of styrene as well, or you could even utilize a strip of brass or metal if that is something that you deem fit. For this build, I'm going to roll with styrene because that's what I use on all of my static 1/6 scale Sherman builds, and it does work pretty well, and I'll be circling back to that as the video continues. Also, I just want to throw this out there. Currently, these are listed on the ECA catalog in resin print. However, if anyone is interested in having these made out of a metal print, that is something that can also be done, but I am going to have to be emailed if you are interested in that, so I can figure out a price in order to price and quote these components out. But anyway, if you're an RC guy and you want to solder these to the brass and you're looking for brass ones, again, just hit me up via the email address listed below, info@eastcoastarmory.com, and potentially we could come up and work something out where we have a set of these made in brass. Jumping forward to the next step, the side skirt rails and the fender mounts have been fabricated, and the mounting bosses have been fitted in place. At this point here, the pieces are going to be primed, then fitted to the model, and then I can actually go ahead and paint the thing. Before they go into painting though, let's go ahead and take a look at what the pieces look like in better light. So here you get to see one of the rails that have been fabricated, and you can see what it looks like with the inner bosses now fitted. With the fabrication method, this is nothing more than just sheet styrene that I measured and I cut to shape with the use of a framing square and a box cutter, just a few score lines, and then the piece just pops right off. From there, I went ahead and carefully marked the location on the tank on where the 3 segments go, and then I carefully counted the holes, and I measured them and drilled them out. And yes, I did count the holes. The holes that you see drilled into these panels here are accurate to the real M4A3 that I did a walk-around video on at this point, what, like 2 or maybe 3 years ago? So that vehicle was a complete crawl boost and was a treasure trove of very valuable information, these pieces here being one of them. As I mentioned before, the Sherman utilized 3 panels for the side skirt rails. No more, no less. 3. We have one on the front, which is this one right here, and the front one has this distinctive angle shape to it where it has a very long cut and it tapers down to this point right over here. The midsection is the most longest, right over here. And then the tail section is a bit of bridge, but it also has a angle cut in, but the angle is a bit shorter compared to the one here on the front, as you can see. As for the holes, again, each segment has the correct amount of holes that are found on the real example. Once the holes were drilled out and everything was sanded nice and smooth to deburr and all that good stuff, it was then time to secure on the bosses. The bosses simply just get glued in place over the hole. And one thing that's nice to point out is that from studying several real variants of the Sherman that I've seen at this point, these pieces, you have some latitude on the alignment, so you don't have to be dead on straight, parallel, or even in order to get these things fitted in place. They can be twisted and cockeyed a little bit because, yes, I actually have seen them like that on more than one occasion. So when you're installing them, you could just basically just wing it, best way to put it. And it'll actually give the tank more closer accuracy compared to just carefully measuring everything out and making sure everything is nice and neatly aligned. And again, it's a nice way to give the tank a little bit of extra personality. So, in addition to the side skirt mounting rails that are on the side, the rear mud flap sections also were fabricated. And on the Sherman, the mud flap sections are a piece of steel that are bent, like you see over here. The bosses are drilled out in these 3 locations, mounted in place, and then the entire unit would be welded on the real one to the model, or actually to the vehicle. On the model over here, obviously they are going to be held in place with some adhesives, and then some sculpted weld beads are going to be added for the use of added detailing, and it's also going to give added rigidity and strength to the piece in order to keep it in place. The front mud flap sections are similar, only they're not angled like you see these ones over here, where I have to cut the piece to shape and bend it. The other ones are just a straight plate that have 3 holes in it for mounting on the front tinwork. Those ones, though, I am going to have to drill some holes and use pins and small little fasteners to hold it onto the sponson. Because of the location, those are a bit more frail, and a bit more strength is going to be required in order to just keep them where they need to be and just prevent any sort of problems as the vehicle ages. For the ones here on the rear, the glues and the epoxy should be enough to hold it in place. From my experience in the past, it has done a pretty good job with doing that. Also, on the internal bosses over here, they are just glued in place. Before I glued them, though, I took a Dremel with a cutting stone and I scuffed the back section up with just so that it adds a little bit more texture, which will help the glues bind the pieces on better. Is this a great mounting method? Well, yes, for a static model. However, if the model was radio controlled, it's not really the best, but I have seen similar glued items actually hold up quite well with the rigors of RC use on some of my armor techs. So you don't want to discount it fully, but that's really, again, a topic for another day. For this model here being static, this mounting system here should be more than suffice. The other thing to mention is the width, but this is something we're going to circle back to once these things are fitted in place, and that's something you can trust me on. Obviously, for the fabrication method on this, I didn't use plastic, I used sheet metal because of the bend that's required. You can't really do that with plastic, it doesn't really look all that great, and also the metal is just, 1, easier to form to this shape, and 2, it just has a very nice realistic bend to it, and when you bend it, it has a nice little curve like you see right there, again, true to form to the real one. If you use just a piece of angled plastic, yeah, you'll get similar shape, but you'll have a nice sharp edge over here as opposed to this nice curved edge, which again is more indicative of the real unit. The other thing I mentioned about the ECA set is that here we can see all of the parts that are not being used. Obviously, I gave you plenty of extra in case something goes awry. You do have plenty of spares on hand. Either you're working on one and one flings off the lost partia, or potentially it's on the tank and one falls off for one reason or another. Fear not, you do have an ample amount of spares at your disposal. For the spares themselves, or I should say for the mounting themselves, they're pretty much good to go out of the box. One thing I did just to help glue adhesion is I took the piece here and I just ran up and down this 320 grit sandpaper. Just a few passes in order to just scuff up the surface, like you see, which will in turn be a much better surface for the adhesives to bind to when it comes time for mounting onto the plastic, or in this case on the metal sections. Fast forwarding a little bit, you can see the strips have been primed with some flat black and are going through their course of installation. On the one here on the front, this was the mount again for the front tin work, which I'm currently working on right now. But this here, the mount is nothing more than just a plate of steel with the 3 mounting holes drilled in and was fastened in place. Now, for the real one, this is where the only place where mine's going to have to deviate again because of those reasons that I mentioned before. But you can see I have 2 extra fasteners here and here, 2 small micro hex bolts that are used to secure the thing in place. These are not present on the real one. The real one's just welded directly to the sponson. But again, with the materials that I'm working with here and with the location, I have to go with the extra fittings because of the structure reasons. But outside of that, these things will just blend in with the remainder of the paintwork and the weathering work once they get applied. At the moment, you can see that the strips are all done on this side of the vehicle, as well as the 2 rear sections. The only thing that needs to be done left is the sculpted weld beads, which will be done shortly after I go ahead and mount the strips on the opposite side. But if I go ahead and pan the camera low, you get to see the holes popping out now in better light. In case anyone is wondering, yes, the 1/6 scale Dragon Sherman does have these sections integrally molded into the leading edge here. However, as I mentioned years ago in the Dragon build series videos that I've done, the strip is mounted too high, and it's actually, again, just a carryover from their 135 brought over into 1/6. On the real vehicle, it's supposed to descend from the sponson, because that way you can actually fasten the side skirts to it. Another thing to mention is that the Dragon one does not have the holes at all, so it's just a complete continuous strip running across the bottom of the hull, as again we see on their 135s. And on that note, it doesn't have the segments like we have right here in the back. And if I go ahead and pan the camera to the front, you can see the one right there on the front. When you're doing a Dragon Sherman and you want to revise this, or you really want to get some better accuracy out of it, as I mentioned in that video, you need to amputate and sand away flush the molded in strip. Fortunately, with the thicknesses is what they are, it's fairly easily done, but you are going to have to do a little bit of elbow grease in order to just polish everything down with some sandpaper on a palm sander. And once that's removed, then you can go ahead and fabricate the new strips. Once they are added, they always improve the model immensely and just really gives it that nice polished look. But that's a nice little quick tidbit for you out there who are building the Dragon Shermans. But again, one little detailing that everybody missed is the inner bosses. And here you can see the bosses now in their locations, as well as not only on the sides, but also on the rear. One thing I also didn't mention, and by the way, here you get to see the strip here that's about to be fitted to the opposite side. Ooh, let's prop it up so it doesn't fall down. Now that everything is primed, you get a better idea on what the pieces actually look like. Like I mentioned before, they are just steel stampings on the real unit, and they are literally just tack welded to 4 locations on each of the 4 corners. The welds are another bit of detailing that's integrally printed on, so there's no sculpting that needs to be done. Everything is ready to go from the get-go. You literally just take the part, and you can mount it to whatever surface that you deem fit. To mount these to the model, just a little bit of super glue is all that's required. As you can see, this side here is going through its installation. And one nice little tidbit that I didn't even anticipate was that because of the extra surface area of the bosses, you have more surface area for the glue to actually grab onto. And when I was applying the glue, I just applied it to the top leading edge here of the strip itself. And just with the way the glues work, when you sandwich it in place, a little bit oozes out, gets onto the top portion of the mounting boss, and again, this just actually gives you some added extra support, so that's a nice little happy accident. From the side skirt mounts takes us to the front mud flaps. Here you get to see one of the front mud flaps essentially ready for painting. At this point here, all of the fabrication work is done, the hand fitting has been completed, and this thing is ready to be primed and then mounted in place after the primer is added. The piece is obviously scratch built, and I went old school on this one, and I fabricated out of stamped sheet metal. The sheet metal is all hand stamped, hand formed to the shape that we have here. If anyone's a fan of the ECA catalog, you'll know that I actually offer metal VVSS Sherman sheet metal front mud flaps as a set. However, those are slightly bigger than this one here because those are designed for the Dragon Sherman. This one here, being a James D. Simone based tank, requires slightly smaller mud flaps. So to do the mud flaps on this one, I actually have to bust out my old template that I have right here. I actually designed this template back in the way back of 2004. So this thing here definitely has some age to it. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And of course, I keep all of my templates. You'll be a fool not to. Templates are like spare parts. You always keep them. Anyway, so I went ahead and traced it over onto the metal, and I went ahead, formed it, and soldered it together. Here you get to see the mud flap for the opposite side. This one here is about to go into its hand fitting, where I go ahead and I drill out the sections for the fasteners, and I also go ahead and add the side rigidity strip. The reason why I don't do that off the model is that I kind of need to take careful measurements to know where everything goes, so everything lines up accordingly. Also, one other thing to mention is that this one here has probably the most advanced mud flaps compared to any of the other Shermans I've done in the past. When it comes to Sherman mud flaps, this is again where almost everybody out there has made a mistake. If you look at all of the model kits out there, regardless of scale and regardless of medium, they basically have the mud flaps in this type of a format. However, if you look at the real ones, and again, I've seen several of them at this point and have them post on the ECA Facebook page, the mud flaps are a little bit more in-depth compared to what they are perceived. So you'll notice that it has a longer tang that sticks out of the back portion here, and we also have this notch found in this section. If we look at this one over here, you get to see exactly why. So in addition to being held in place with these three fasteners found on the top, it's also held in place by a few fasteners on the side. There's two right over here that bolt directly into the side of the transmission cover, and then right where this piece interacts with the final drive, there's a fastener or two that place piggyback, and in addition to securing the final drive to the transmission cover, also sandwiches the tin work to that section there, again keeping it as strong and as sturdy as possible. Almost every single build out there does it incorrectly, so this is something that I am going to have on this build. At some point in time, I would like to retire the metal ones that are found on the catalog with proper 3D printed ones, but that's going to be something potentially for an upgrade in the future, but for the time being, the metal ones stay the way they are. Also, I just want to point out, the metal ones that are on the ECA catalog are a direct replacement for the Dragon ones, and because of that, they do not have the extra long plate that we have here, because this is something that, frankly, on this build, I kind of have to hand custom tune in order to get the piece to fit right. So, trying to make a one-size-fits-all, a little bit tricky at this time. But again, as more time goes on and I start working on these things a little bit more, then you'll probably see a replacement set for the old tried and true metal ones come to form. But for the time being, you get to appreciate old school handcrafted sheet metal goodness like this one over here. One thing about the sheet metal work is that the embossed crimp over here is actually really embossed into it. You flip it over, you can see the press line right over here, and this does twofold. First, it actually does make the piece a bit more rigid, but it also gives you the appropriate detailing both inside and out. If you just glue a half-round stock to this section over here, you kind of get the look, but it's not really perfect because you are missing that all-important little groove found on the inside. With the tin work going through its coat of primer, it's now time to go ahead and start working on the upper hull. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm going over all of the hull plates and just removing any sort of slight imperfections that are found on the surface, things like little divots, stuff along those lines. As you can see, these were just quickly addressed with a few little smears of red putty. Once the putty's set, I can go ahead and polish it down with the sandpaper, and that should take care of the divots permanently. The next thing I went ahead and did was actually I started refining and working on the Bound 1919 mount. Originally, when this piece was sculpted on, it wasn't done all that cleanly, admittedly, so I went ahead now and refined it further. To do this, I utilized a Dremel with a router bit, as well as also a high-speed removal bit, removing the material that was in the area, making the piece much more even and also much more symmetrical. As you can see, it looks much more refined compared to the way we had it originally. On the Jumbo over here, because this is just an added plate on top of the standard armor, they did have to cut these little notches into these two sections just so it can clear the pivoting of the 1919. While the procedure was going on, you can see I had a little blowout in this area over here. If I go ahead and get my hand in here, hopefully you can see that. There you go. It was obviously just a little thin section here of fiberglass resin, so there was a small little blowout. But fortunately, that's really easily addressed once I go over with the epoxy sculpt for the weld beads, which will be happening sooner than later. The other thing is with this guy over here. When this guy was casted, it looks like a little chunk here of gel coat popped off. So this is something that's easily going to be fixed with a little smear, again, of the epoxy sculpt. Moving topside takes us to the bow hatch area, and the backup periscopes that were originally molded in have been amputated. Originally, when I built the Master all those years ago, I utilized my cast resin Sherman backup periscope covers, so they actually were fairly detailed. However, they were just a little bit on the rougher side due to the way the thing was molded, and also since the years that I built this one, I actually designed a replacement set that are 3D printed. Those have been on the catalog now for a few years, and those are the ones that actually retired the old ones that were originally built into this model here. So I am going to have a set printed out, and those are going to be dropped in place. But to do that, the area needed to have some prep work. The original molded in periscopes were hogged away by just using the high-speed removal bit over here, removing the material until finally I was able to get nice and flat, and then I descended into the plate here, adding the little wells, which is again something that would be found on the real one. Once the bodywork goes in this section over here, it's going to look much more refined compared to the way we had it originally. Also, in the next couple scenes or so, I am going to go ahead and cut out the hatch well areas, as well as also revise the hinge here for the hatches, because, well, it's best to get to that sooner than later. And unlike the grills in the back, where I have to get those 3D printed, these are cast resin, so I have them on stock, and I can go ahead and cast up a set and do the appropriate hinge work that's required in order to get the piece fleshed out. Once that's done, I can then essentially wrap this section up over here quite nicely. And the other thing that I'm going to be doing, of course, at this time is adding the weld beads. That's going to be needed for all the spot welds for the tinwork sections. But I'm also going to be adding the welds on the armor areas as well. To do that, I need to go ahead and just do a little prep work on the molded in weld beads that were found on the front leaning edges over here. There was originally a weld bead integrally molded on. It's a little bit on the rougher side, so I went ahead and cleaned it up, which gives me a perfect surface now to etch brand new ones out of the epoxy sculpt, which again will be happening probably in the next scene or two. Continuing along takes us to this point here where a good portion of the welds have been sculpted. It's also important to point out that many more welds are needed to be added to the build in order to complete it, but this should give us a good portion that has been knocked out of the way. With the camera brought in closer, you get to see what has been added at this time. Most notably, the welds have been added to the side skirt mounting rail, as you can see right there along the leading edge. And one thing to point out about the welds on these areas is that they are stitch welds, so they are not welded continuous through and through. This is a mistake you can possibly make on your build, and when you're doing a Sherman, be sure to add the welds if you're going to do so in the following format. As you can see, the welds are segmented out. Most importantly, though, is where the last and front section meet up with the middle area, there are two welds that are close to each other, just like so. Other than those two, the remainder are generally equal distance from one another. But it is important to point out that the one on the front does have slightly closer of a gap compared to the ones towards the middle section of the vehicle. These details here really come out after the tank is painted and weathered, and it really gives it that nice polished, finalized look. It's one of those things where if you go ahead and add them, they will really kick your build up to another notch. That's not just true for the 1/6 scale example over here, but it's also true for the 1/16 models as well, as this is something that I always add on my 1/16 builds for the exact same reason, and the end results always do speak for themselves. This takes us to one of the more noteworthy welds to mention on the Jumbo, and that is this distinctive weld bead found right here on the side armor plate. Remember, Jumbos are built up from the factory, and they just have extra plates that are welded to the side section here in order to build it up and give it extra armor. Well, one thing to mention is that the side armor plates on basically every single Jumbo that's left in existence was a two-piece assembly. So because of this, you have this distinctive weld mark found right here on the middle section of the armor. If you're working on a small-scale Jumbo, be it a 135, generally they have these weld beads integrally molded on, specifically some of the newer tooling kits. However, if you're working on one of the older Tamiya ones, it is absent with this little bit of detailing. If you want to add this to your build, it's a great way to, again, improve the accuracy of the older kit, and fortunately, it's really easy to do. The orientation lines up perfectly with the last rib here found on the middle VVSS housing. So essentially all you do is with a square, you go ahead and line it up, and go straight up to the top portion of the plate. You mark that with a pencil, and ta-da, you now know exactly where the weld bead's got to go. Moving topside, you can see the welds that have been wrapping around the top section as well. And you'll notice that I went ahead and added the welds on the rear portion here of the hull, as well as also on the first row of welds that are going to be needed on the side hull. Note I said first row. On Jumbo specifically, there are 2 rows of weld beads that are present. Again, this is because the Jumbo is nothing more than a standard factory-produced M4A3 with extra armor welded to the side. So because of that, you have the original armor that was found on the tank when first built by Ford, and that armor would have been welded on, and then they just simply took these plates, attached them to the side, and added a second row of welds. Because of that, you will have 2 weld beads found in the top location. Currently, the first row has been added, and the second row will follow as the build progresses. On the model over here, I actually went ahead and built this detailing in. When I first did the master, I went ahead and sculpted on some weld beads with a Dremel, and I did 2 rows. However, the new sculpted weld beads with the epoxy are a bit cleaner and look a little bit better compared to the original example that was molded into the kit's tooling. Also, something that you may notice is that the welds are currently not running all the way to the front. The reason for this is quite simple. This area here needs to be reworked with the addition of the hatches, as well as added cast texturing and other modifications that may have to be hand fit in order to get everything, the hinges and the hatches to fit in just right. So there's going to be quite a bit of grinding and cutting that are going to go into this section over here. So go ahead and continuing the welds at this time is really haphazard. They're more likely going to get in the way or covered up with the built-up layers of bodywork. So it's best to just go ahead and halt the welds at this point right here for the time being, and then I could go ahead and just simply continue the weld beads once this area here is ready to go. Also, you can see I add a little bit of epoxy on this section here. There was a bit of a sink mark found in this area. Nothing too egregious, but a little swipe of epoxy over here filled it in, and it could then blend in with the remainder of the cast texturing that will be added to this piece as the build continues. And yes, these are casted on the real unit, and more information on that is to come. Moving our way to the rear of the tank, you can see the weld beads again added on these sections here. Now remember when I said there's 2 rows of welds? Well, technically there would be another row of welds that secure the rear plate to the hull itself. However, on these vehicles, the weld is running along this section here of the hull, and obviously with the armor placed over that area, you're not going to be able to see those welds anymore, so they're just entombed underneath the armor plate. So if you're working on a Jumbo, you only have 1 weld bead to worry about on the rear section over here. The original weld beads that were sculpted in were, again, just ground off with a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit just to square the area off, and prepped it for me to then sculpt the new weld beads that are a little bit more improved compared to the original examples. Also in this area, you get to see the rear tin work mounts that have been added in place. Their weld beads have been sculpted, which again, do twofold. It gives you the much needed detailing for the welds that would be found in this area over here, and also gives a bit more structure and support that hold these pieces in place. One other thing that I always mention on these Sherman builds is when you're scratch building these pieces over here, you may be very tempted to have the fender mount go from one end all the way up to the other, and that is inaccurate. On these Shermans, there is a gap found in this section right over here, and you notice it's the same thing on the opposite side. On the M4A3 specifically, this area is needed for the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust to protrude from the rear. However, the same is also true for the one on the opposite side, even though the Little Joe auxiliary generator is not present on this area, but it's literally a mirror image on each side. This is one thing I always advocate in my Sherman builds, be it 135 to 1.6. And so again, one of those things where if you do properly, it will definitely improve the look of the tank and give you much needed accuracy as well as detailing. And after not a whole lot of time later, you can see what it looks like with both tinwork now fitted in place. The mud flaps are secured in their appropriate locations, and you can see how much they flesh out the model compared to the way we had it before. On the mounting, there's quite a lot going on over here, so we'll just start from the inner portions. As I mentioned before, there are several other fasteners that are used to secure this thing in place besides the three top-mounted ones that we all know about. Over here you can see two of them that are serving double duty, where they are sandwiching the tinwork in place, all while at the same time sandwiching the, or I should say, keeping the final drive secured to the transmission mount. The other two fasteners are right over there. And you can see that they also do a pretty good job with keeping the tail section firmly in place. Note the size of the fasteners, because this is actually going to come into play momentarily. Because this brings us to the three that we have right here on the top. So of course, these are the three fasteners that we all know of when we think of Sherman tanks. However, one thing that a lot of people don't think about is the fastener orientation. At quick glance, it just looks like three simple bolts that hold this thing in place, and that is true to a certain extent. However, what throws everyone off is the orientation. Quick question, if you look at these three fasteners, is this the top portion of the bolt or the bottom? Time's up. If you guess the top portion of the bolt, you're wrong. The fasteners are actually held in place from the bottom outward. So on the top portion here of the hull, we have the nuts that are then used to tighten the thing down in place. So you actually see little threaded sections coming out of each of these fasteners. The reason why this is done, lower profile. Less crap that can get snagged up by the tracks during the tank's operation. On the fasteners themselves, the threads are really short, so I went ahead and utilized 256 breast bolts. These ones over here specifically. And I went ahead and used matching small scale fasteners to go ahead and match them. And that's another thing I want to mention, specifically for doing these in 1/6 scale. A lot of guys, myself included in the past, utilize fasteners that are too large. We've generally went with M3 hex bolts because, well, it's a nice strong fastener and it does a good job holding everything in place. However, that is inaccurate. Those fasteners are too large, and if you've ever seen them on real Shermans, these things are actually really tiny. In fact, I'll go on and say I believe these may also be nylocks if I'm not mistaken, but I have to take some closer looks at several of the real vehicles that I've done walkarounds on. Either way, the nut is what you see on the top portion here. To secure these in place, they were bolted together, and then I went ahead and snipped off the extra thread with the wire cutter, and with a Dremel I went ahead and polished the tops smooth so that they don't have the little burr protruding from the top of them. To keep the fastener from undoing itself during the cleanup, before that was done, a thin little drop of really thin and runny super glue was added to each, which will essentially act as a Loctite. No, Loctite's not utilized on this. There's no point to utilize on a model that's static. So the super glue was used in its place because, one, it dries a hell of a lot faster compared to the Loctite, and for what it's needed for, it does the job perfectly fine. If you go ahead and not utilize any sort of glue or Loctite, when you're doing the cleanup with the Dremel, the threads have a bad habit of backing themselves out and the thing gets loose on you. And needless to say, the installation of the other fender here was the exact same thing, but done as a mirror image. On the lip over here, you get to see how this support strap basically just fits on top of the transmission itself. On a standard Sherman, this actually fits on pretty well with the way the armor thickness is on that vehicle. However, on a Jumbo, things are a little bit problematic because of how thick this section is over here. It's a bit bulbous, and getting the piece to fit in does require a little bit of hand fitting. But if you go ahead and hand fit the part appropriately, this is the look that we have here. So the strip does a good job with, one, making the tin work much stronger, but also you can see it kind of eats up that gap that would have been this section over here where we have the final drive making contact with the transmission cover itself. Also, one thing to point out, with all of these fasteners now fit in place, these things here are rock solid. And as you can see, with all these components fitted in place, the side and front of the model are fleshing out very, very nicely. I'd say in all, the tank is about 25 to maybe 30% complete, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this is actually the perfect point to springboard off of, and once the remainder of the components come in, I could go ahead and get the ball rolling on this, which will of course pick up steam and basically careen to the ending. The model is currently waiting on a couple parts in order to get to that point, and two of which are going to be required to flesh out and complete the suspension and lower hull. One of which are the sprockets. Currently, I'm working in CAD to go ahead and come up with the sprockets that are going to fit this, and more importantly, time with the Dragon track, which I will be utilizing on this, or at least that's the idea at this point. The other thing is for the rear deflector diffuser grill. This is something in the past where I used to make out of sheet metal that was bent, cut, soldered together to get the shape. And although that many viewers out there might think that's awesome, which it was for the longest time, it's time to put that set to bed, retire it, because I now have a 3D printed counterpart, which is actually way better compared to anything I could have possibly fabricated out of sheet metal, and that one has been completed, and it's currently, at the time of filming this, in production. As for what it looks like, well, currently on screen you should see some sample photographs of the unit in question, and as you can see, it's got a lot of really cool details going on for it, and once it comes in, I'll definitely be able to show it in better light. Needless to say, once that component gets fit in place, the rear section is done, with the exception of also adding the tow hitch, but one step at a time. First the grill, then the tow hitch, and then the rear section is completed 100%. With that going on, the next area that I'm going to be turning my attention to is the bow hatch area. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be cutting out these sections over here, and I've also been starting with some of the revision process with the amputation of the original molded-in periscopes. Also, as a quick preview, here you got to see one of the units I'm going to be using for this vehicle here. This is a ECA cast rested item. This is actually an off piece. I kind of drilled a hole all the way through when I was prepping it for the customer, so I got casted a fresh one. This one here is going to be used for my build, because obviously that's something I can take care of. But customers always get the best quality parts. Anyway, the component does slightly fit on this vehicle over here, but I am going to need to do some hand fitting in order to get the piece to fit on properly. This part here was designed for the Dragon M4A3, and obviously the vehicle here is based on the James D. Simone vehicle, which later became Plastic Panzers, and now it's Battleground vehicles. These kits have quite a history to them. But anyway, that's the thing I mentioned in part 1 of the series. Back to this one over here. So yeah, you're going to see I'm going to need to do a little bit of revisions going on in order to prep this piece to polish up further. That's really the last of the heavy work that needs to be done to the hull, but like I stated before, that's going to be something for a future video down the road. One other thing I want to mention about the front, besides the new 3D printed periscopes, another new item that I designed specifically while working on this project over here was the front blower. Yes, the front blower was something that I've been wanting to replace with a fresh one. For the longest time, since like what, 2010 or so, I've been producing that component, but it was made out of cast resin. Well, that one has been retired in favor of the brand new 3D printed one, which is something that is going to be used on this build. And again, you can probably see the thumbnails of the CAD work on the screen right now. So really looking forward to getting my hands on that to drop it on this model over here. But again, more information on that is certainly to come, so stay tuned. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posts of content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or my other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in loop of new posts of content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.